Chapter 3, Infancy and Social Emotional Development. In this section, we are going to discuss an overview of social emotional development, an overview of the social emotional milestones in infancy, emotional development, self and others, and psychosocial development. So, an overview of social emotional development. Social emotional development are the experiences, expressions, and management of emotions and the ability to establish positive rewards and relationships with others. It deals with interpersonal, dealing with other people, and intrapersonal, self relations. So, some of the milestones of social emotional in infancy. So, during this time, starting at 2 months, they start to smile and they show signs of calming themselves by bringing their hands to their mouth and sucking on them, their thumb, or maybe even a pacifier. And they also try to look at parents, especially when they're spoken to. At 4 months, they smile occasionally, especially at people. They like to play with people, but they may cry if the playing stops, or they may have a little stranger danger. And they will mimic some facial expressions, such as sticking out their tongue, or smiling. At 6 months, they start to recognize familiar faces and they know if someone is a stranger. They like to look at themselves in the mirror and they may respond to other people's emotions and they might like to also play with people. At 9 months, they may become fearful of strangers. They may be clingy with familiar adults and they may develop or have a favorite toy. At 12 months, they may become nervous around strangers. They may cry when parents leave. They may have favorite things or people that they would prefer to be around. And they may hand you books for reading. They may put out an arm or a leg when helping get dressed. So they're starting to learn what we know as scripts. They know how to follow a procedure or a routine for a day. So, emotional development. So, during this time, there's some foundational concepts for emotional development. So, emotions are subjective feelings such as love or joy that help to define our existence as human beings. Emotional development is very dependent upon brain development. And emotions do have the following things. They're physiological aspects of them. There's cognitive and subject feeling aspects, and there's also behavioral aspects, meaning it's within a socio-cultural context. So there are some basics of emotional development. So primary emotions, these are emotions that are present at birth or shortly after birth. And it's believed that these are hardwired into our brains. We're born with them. And it's also thought this way because they serve as an adaptive purpose to help us get our needs met during our dependency during infancy. Now, ways that infants show primary emotions are things such as social smiling. So, smiling in response to a social stimulation or stimulation from others. So, infants smile to elicit caregiving. If we're smiling and we're laughing, more out to get what we need and get our emotions and our needs met. It also reinforces nurturing from caregivers, and it causes positive interactions. Stranger weariness or stranger anxiety is another way that infants show primary emotions, and it serves as an adaptive person, and it can prevent infants from straying too far from their caregivers. But it can also be caused by the environment and them not feeling safe. With time and space, though, infants can overcome stranger weariness and will begin to interact once they feel comfortable, but not pushing it upon them because then that can cause a phobia. Social referencing is another way that infants show primary emotions. And this is when an infant will look at a parent's face and behavior for how to act. So if a parent acts weary towards a stranger, the child is more out to act weary. Same thing with dogs or animals. If a parent acts scared, the child is also going to be conditioned to act that way. Secondary emotions are dependent upon cognitive development. So it's an ability of merging primary emotions together. And this emerges around 18 to 24 months. Now, emotions do vary by culture and ways of being. So when they're looking for that social referencing, they're going to look for how they should act in certain situations, and those will become their emotions. So it involves the blending of two emotions, but it can be more. So examples of this might be embarrassment or pride or guilt or contentment. So if we look at guilt, that would be a combination of joy and fear. So you were happy about doing it, but you were guilty about getting or fearful about getting in trouble, which led you to feel guilty. And there's a lot of examples here. So despair is when you have fear that causes sadness. So early emotion regulation. So self-regulation is the ability to monitor and control one's behaviors, emotions, or thoughts. And there's many ways that infants regulate their emotions. Some of these are self-soothing, some of these are from caregivers. Now, self-soothing is closing of eyes when they don't want something, or they may look away when they don't want food. They may move close to a loved one when afraid so that they have that comfort. They may suck on a pacifier or a thumb. They may put an object in their mouth to calm themselves. They may rub their head with a blanket or with an object. Or they may hold an object and not want to let it go because that is their attachment, their security mechanism. So, temperament. So there's many different types of temperament when it comes to infants and toddlers. So temperament is a baby's approach to the world and their behavioral orientation. So there may be a difficult temperament, a slow to warm up temperament, or an easy temperament, all depending on their environment and how they can regulate themselves. And we talked about this in the newborn. Now, goodness of fit is one of the most important things when it comes to temperament. And this is how adaptable a child's environment is to the temperaments of the child. So, a good fit is when a parent and a child can lead to good developmental outcomes, meaning that the caregivers feel as if they can meet the needs of the baby's temperament. Now, a poor fit could place the child at risk for poor development because the parents may get upset, they may yell. Um, a lot of child abuse could happen from this, where a parent's trying everything and they get frustrated and they yell, or they may neglect in some way. And this could be based off of goodness or fit. But again, getting oriented to a new baby is very, very difficult. But learning ways, asking for help and resources is really, really helpful in getting that goodness of fit to work for the parents or the caregivers and the baby's temperaments. So, attachment is a strong affectional tie or emotional bond between two individuals. And attachment between a baby and a caregiver is universal. It is needed for survival. Attachment is essential for well being. And attachment involves mutual interactions. So the baby can't just expect the interaction, the caregiver also has to expect it. So they have to match up. And that's where the temperament comes in too, because that could cause an issue with attachment. Now, Bowlby says that there are 4 phases of attachment. There's undiscriminatory social responsiveness, which is pre-attachment, and that's where a baby doesn't show a particular attachment to anyone. There's discriminatory in social responsiveness, where the infant really prefers one person or just a couple of people. Actively seeking physical proximity control is when the infant really wants to gain a bond with certain people. And then goal-corrected partnership is when there's a certain goal in mind that the infant is trying to achieve. So, what purpose does attachment serve? Well, it's a desire to be near the attachment figure. And it's primarily a safety security base. And it signals to elicit caregiver behavior. So when a baby cries or smiles, they're going to get a certain reaction from a caregiver. And they learn that they're conditioned to act in that way to get that behavior that they're wanting. And development of mental models of self, so they really learn about their self-worth and their ability to trust others based off of this attachment. So when they cry, do they get their needs met or do they not? And they learn to trust or not trust their world based off of those interactions and those attachments with their caregivers. So caregiver behavior does influence the quality of attachment. The more responsive and dependable they are, the more warm, the more secure a baby is going to feel. If they're unresponsive or unpredictable or insensitive or neglectful or abusive, that will result in an insecure attachment and can cause future issues with development. But same thing with being too attached can also have some impacts on future behavior and development. So there's two types of attachment patterns. There's secure attachment and insecure attachment. So secure attachment is when an infant misses a caregiver when he or she leaves the room and greets them as soon as they return back. So they're happy that they are back. Insecure patterns would be avoidant insecure, and that's when an infant doesn't seem to care if the caregiver is there or comes back. Preoccupied insecure is when an infant is terribly upset, almost inconsolable until the caregiver comes back. That can cause extreme anxiety. And then disorganized or disoriented attachment is when an infant lacks a cohesive strategy with coping with strange situations. So they sometimes are inconsolable, sometimes they're okay. You never quite know how they're going to be. So they may be depressed and angry, or they may be non-responsive, or they may be erratic at times. It all depends on those attachments made with the caregivers. So that balance of being independent and dependent is very important. Allowing a balance so that one of these is not heavier than the other to where the baby isn't distraught when you leave. So we are going to pause and process what we have discussed so far. So go back and review as needed to answer these questions. So self and others. So self-recognition is the ability to recognize oneself. And this has been experimented a couple of times with infants to gauge, are they aware of their self? And this is what is known as the mirror test experiment, where they would put a dot on the child's face and then they would show them a mirror to see if they realized that that was them and that they had a dot either on their nose or on their forehead, to see if they recognize that what they see is a representation of their self. Now, self-awareness is a child's use of self-referencing pronouns, using their own name and maybe labeling themselves by sex or by age. And pro-social behavior is a growing sense of self and others. So sense of others. So they may start comforting others when they're sad or worried, and they may have early emotion recognition of others and empathy. And this is primarily because they're developing what is known as theory of mind, that what they think and how they feel may not be what others think and others feel. So if they see someone falls and gets hurt, they may go and kiss them on the cheek or hug them or try to calm them or comfort them from crying. So playing in infancy, play is a big deal. And when you think of play, you probably think of being on the playground or playing with toys. At this age, it is. However, we still play all the way into adulthood. We still play every day because play is just manipulating our environment to learn. And in infancy, they're learning through touching objects, seeing how things work. So, a couple of types of play that we see in infancy are parallel play, which is where they're side by side, but they're not interacting with each other. They may observe what the other is doing, but they don't have a goal together of what they're playing. So, for instance, these two are sitting side by side playing with the same objects and they're looking at each other, but they're not building or playing with the blocks together. Whereas here, cooperative play is the willingness to play with one another. This is cooperative because they're building a tower together. Exploratory play is object oriented, which means they're playing with the same objects to see what to do. So they may build a sand castle. Now, exploratory play could be parallel and it could also be cooperative, depending on if they're playing with the same object side by side or if they're trying to build a sand castle together. Symbolic play is when they use objects in a pretend fashion. So when they play house or they play mommy and baby, that would be symbolic. And again, parallel play would be when they're playing with babies, but they're not playing with the same baby. But if they're pretending that one is grandma and one is mommy, or one is mommy and one is daddy, and they're taking care of the baby together, that would be cooperative symbolic play. So, daycare and home care providers is something that is very big in social emotional development because the quality of this care will have an impact on how they interact with their environment and also with their attachment and their language and everything that comes with development. So, developmental consequences of daycare and nanny is dependent upon a couple of things: the quality, the number of hours spent there, and the parent child interaction when at home. So, if the parents work a lot and they're at daycare or with a nanny a lot, having a quality daycare or nanny is very important to build that language or to build those routines or those self regulations. Now, there are some pros and cons of different daycare providers or home care providers. So, a nanny, some pros of this is that they work with your schedule, and nanny shares can lower cost, especially if you have a live-in nanny or someone who rents a room from you and nannies or helps. They can also customize care for your child at different hours. Now, some cons of it is that they lack oversight. There's more tax paperwork and they're generally more expensive than a daycare. Now, in terms of lack of oversight, they may not be a certified nanny, they may not have any training, background checks, and things like that. So, that is a big factor as well. Now, daycares, pros of that is most of them are licensed and they're vetted, insurance, all those things. They're structured spaces and hours, often doubles as a preschool, and there's a lot of social interaction for children. So they get to learn how to interact with others. Some cons of it is a lot of daycares have a lot of turnover. So your child may be with one person one time and you get comfortable, and then they may leave and you have to start with a whole new person. They are a little bit more inflexible with schedules because they have a set hour. So if you work the night shift, you may need a nanny compared to having a daycare. There is more exposure to germs, and that's where vaccinations and things come into play when some parents do vaccinate and some parents don't. And then it can cost as much as a 4-year state college. Daycares, nannies, any child care providers are very, very expensive. So that's why some parents may stay home to take care of their children. And then once they go to school, they may go and return back to work because it is very expensive. So we are going to pause and process what we have covered so far. So go back and review as needed to address these questions. So psychosocial development. So Erickson's psychosocial development states that infants and toddlers are in stage 1, which is known as trust versus mistrust. And during this time, infants are in a crisis. They are trusting that their needs are going to be met, or they develop mistrust, which means that they did not form the attachments and did not get their needs met during this age. So infants develop feelings of trust or a lack of trust. If adults meet the needs, then the baby develops trust. If the adults are inconsistent or they have unpleasant interactions with caregivers, the baby develops mistrust. And this filters into the next stage, into early childhood. So, goals, psychosocial development goals. Well, we want infants to develop and establish basic trust. So, basic trust is a sense that others are predictable and you can rely on them. And if trust is not met, then mistrust is developed. And again, this is all based off of caregivers' behaviors, not just the parents, but also any family members, child care providers, doctors, all of these things. And it's all based off of these caregivers meeting the baby's needs and bonding. And what this does is, as they get trust, they start acquiring a sense of autonomy. And autonomy is establishing personal boundaries and self differentiation from things and others. And if autonomy is not developed, shame and doubt are developed. So if a baby is mistrusting in their environment, they may not be autonomous in trying new things. They may be scared or afraid that they're going to do something wrong. So they're going to feel shame and doubt themselves instead of being autonomous and trying new things. And again, this is all based off of caregiver behaviors. So letting the infant explore and try new things is crucial in building autonomy. Because if the infant wants to try something and you always tell the infant no, then they're going to feel shame and doubt and not want to try. And when they get into school age, that's going to have an even bigger impact when they're learning academic content. Praising and motivating an infant is also a way to help build autonomy. If an infant is always yelled at or made to feel bad, then shame and doubt is going to kick in. And then assisting but not doing the task for the infant. So supporting, scaffolding is supporting, but not doing everything. So things like eating, letting them hold the spoon and try, even if they make a mess, it still builds autonomy. And if you don't let them build that autonomy, even if they're going to make a mess, then shame and doubt's going to come in, and then they may never want to feed themselves. So we're going to pause and process again to reflect on what we have discussed so far. And that is the end of this section.